Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Bruce, MD, again. And today we're going to be finishing up on our podcast regarding the recent dictators. We were just talking about Adolf Hitler yesterday. And Adolf Hitler, interestingly enough, has provided us with an unusual an unusual insight into the actual workings of this type of personality's mind. It's very chilling because it's real. He believed what he said, and I will explain it and I'll read it. In 1940, the end of 1944, December, Hitler issued an order to everybody that all the fields, agricultural fields in Germany and under German control should be burned. Okay? Why should they be burned? So the Allies wouldn't have food to eat when they invaded Germany. Very foolish order. Why? Because the Allies were capable of bringing in food for their own people. It was work, but they could do it. And Hitler had no idea that they could do that. Either way, so that order basically penalized his own people, would have killed them all, or a lot of them. So what happened? Albert Speer, you might call the best way I can tell his job is he was kind of the operations officer for Hitler, meaning Hitler gave the orders, talked to his cabinet, and Speer would be the one on the ground that would make everything happen and oversee it. And it's like the operations officer we had when I was in the CB battalion, MCB 40. And it was like, okay, now Speer read that, and this comes from the Nuremberg trials, so that's my source. And Speer read this, and he was horrified. At this point, everything was catching up with the Germans. It's about time. Too little, too late. Way too little. And what Speer realized, if he did that, there'd be no food for his people, men, women, children, and anybody else. So he decided he'd go see Hitler, talk to him, and try and talk him out of that ridiculous order. And however, Hitler's so busy, there's so much going on, he couldn't get in to see Hitler until January 25th, 1945. And this is what transpired. The first thing he said was he asked him to rescind his order. Hitler refused outright. Then Speer said if we burn all the fields, kill all the animals, there would be no food for their own people to eat, and all could die, including the women and children. Hitler's response was a very chilling look into the mind of one of the worst dictators of all time. But believe it or not, the same thought process goes with them all. It went in Robespierre's mind. It probably went into Cromwell's mind, and Burr and Conway in our country never got far enough to be in that position. So Hitler was the next in line to be in that position where they controlled everything, including life and death for their people. So this is Hitler's response. I'm going to read this here. It's not perfect, but it's close to exactly what he said. Because they were doing so poorly in the war, the people did not deserve to live. Think about that. Okay? Well, that's okay. People, they say that all the time, but he meant it. And his order was to destroy all their food because they couldn't win the war. And that's scary. Okay? He would have done it. He wasn't joking, because you'll see next. Then Hitler added, "Do not bring this up again. If you do, things will not go well for you." Okay? That's a threat, by the way. And it also shows the level of Hitler's delusion and insanity. He thinks it's all going to happen, you know. And a month later, 2 months later, he went underground and never was seen again. He just stayed in this underground little bunker, or it was almost a city, that to be protected from the bombing. Okay, and that's where he died, uh, around April 30th. So now Speer left, but did not comply with the order. He moved the equipment around on railroads and had to get it lost in sidings far away from where it was needed to accomplish this task. And the result was no fields were burned. Food wasn't destroyed. Hitler didn't know that, and it wasn't important, and Speer was sense enough to know that. Doing what he did saved thousands of lives and was a cornerstone of Speer's request for clemency, which was finally granted. Okay? Now, clemency in this case didn't mean he was off the hook, scot-free. He was given a 20-year sentence in prison. He went to Spandau prison for starting the day after the judgment was passed. There was no relief. He was going to have to serve every single one of the 20 years, and he did. And he was finally let go in 1966. That is an interesting comment. It's the first I've seen, and you don't get that very often, right directly into the minds of these people, these dictators who are all clinically insane with the same disease. But that's a good place to get that. And fortunately, if Speer hadn't done that and did what he did, things might have turned out a lot differently, mostly for the German civilians. And that's sad. And that's how twisted Hitler's mind was. And it's how, if things keep going, that's how twisted the mind of dictators are and where they will go. Just like Robespierre's mind became so twisted that he executed people with a guillotine, 25,000 people over a period of 9 months. That's the personality type. Now, external forces control them, and it's controlled Trump to some extent before this. But he's deteriorating now. He's going to go this direction. He started with the wars, and we're talking about Venezuela. We're talking about Iran. And that's what we have to realize, because once the wars are done, he gets depressed. And when he gets depressed, he'll figure out a way to get into another war, because that excites him. That means he's kind of like the White Knight in his mind, charging out to destroy the enemies, the false enemy. And if there's anybody, he's the only type of knight he is Don Quixote. At least you could understand Don Quixote. He had lost it. He wasn't a dictator. But that's how disturbed the mind of Donald J. Trump is, okay? And if he can keep fighting wars, he'll keep himself from being depressed. Now, he doesn't know this underneath. He can't. His consciousness can't deal with it. His subconsciousness kind of has him doing things that make him feel better. By the way, one of the things our subconscious is responsible for is keeping us alive as long as we can. That's how this whole process comes about. So what you would see, let's say next month the war in Iran was over and everything was calming down. Well, the next thing you know, he'd be trying to start another war. And if people started standing up to him here, which is what has to happen, he is out of control. He will start a physical and possibly violent civil war here in this country. That's because he lives in a delusional world, the same way Hitler did, the same way Robespierre did. And if you look at it, it's the same way Cromwell did as well. And for the next couple of dictators, you'll see it's the same way. That's the beauty of history. That's the beauty of understanding what history is. And it's the beauty of understanding what the latest genetics studies have provided for us in today's world. Without the genetic studies and an understanding of what our DNA is responsible for in our cells, we couldn't do this with any clarity. And this allows us to do it with certainty. Okay, it gives us the information we need to begin to put this together. And this is important to understand. And if I say it again, I'm liable to repeat it more because the more you hear it, the more you remember. Okay. Now, you look what it took to stop Hitler. Okay, he was nuts. And, there are all kinds of things you can say about Hitler. And the non-professional ones, are kind of funny. The diagnosis, nuttier than a fruitcake, um, things like that. But he was clinically insane. And it extended into what he ordered Albert Speer to do. And that's very mentally sick, okay? And at that point, they had to do everything they had to do. And that was that. The war ended, okay? Now we move up north or east to Joseph Stalin, okay? He's the next dictator we're going to talk about. Joseph Stalin took over leadership in the Communist Party in 1927, okay? Now, that was the year that Lenin died. And it was the year that Trotsky had to leave Russia in a hurry and went to Mexico to live, leaving Stalin as the head man. And Stalin, at that point, became a monster. He decided Russia's going to be equal to all the Western Europe countries and the United States overnight. Got that? So what he did to show that Russia was equal, the first thing he did, he was going to build a complete underground subway in Moscow and its surrounding area. But he needed workers, and nobody wanted the job. He took his middle class. When the communists took over, they eliminated the class structure, and a lot of the middle class ended up in prison. Now, in case you're wondering, modern societies can't go without their middle class, okay? Now, the upper class thinks they can, that they're the most important thing. No, the middle class and the labor classes are essential for us to be a thriving society, okay? And so what Stalin did, he had everybody in the middle class in the area, it was a lot of people, arrested and sent to forced labor on this railroad. And over the next 3 years, or however it looked to finish the railroad, people had to work from sunrise to sunup, and they didn't get the people running these construction sites didn't give a damn, didn't care about how they felt, what was on, if they had diseases, if people died, their bodies were removed quickly and buried or whatever they did with them. And thousands of people died for that railroad. In the end, it was done. And I don't know how, you know, Russians are very good about shoveling things under the table or under the rug and not looking at them again. Okay. And it's a strange, very strange situation. Now, after the railroad was finished, Stalin was now having to deal with Hitler, and he couldn't bulldoze any other projects, and it was clear that he was going to need weaponry. So he started working on the military and trying to, you know, be diplomatic with Adolf Hitler. That's ridiculous, of course. You can't be diplomatic and negotiate with a dictator type of personality. Because of their ego defects, they see themselves as invincible. So they've constructed a plan that they are going to put into effect no matter what. Okay. They'll manipulate people, they'll sign agreements, which to them mean nothing. It's just a way of buying time and keeping the enemy off balance. That's it. And while they continue with what they're doing. So eventually, Stalin signed a treaty with Germany and Hitler, a non-aggression treaty. So they could each do what they wanted, but they wouldn't attack each other. You know, now Stalin, neither had any illusions about that treaty. That just bought time. It bought time that was important for Stalin. So now during the war, all of his efforts had to go into war. And a lot of his dictatorial personalities had to be subverted because once his people were attacked by Germany, you know, Germany ran all over them initially. And all they could do was figure out a way to defend themselves and then eventually attack Germany and drive them out. During that time, Stalin, when he dealt with Roosevelt and Churchill, was always an annoying person. Okay, he didn't care about, and this is important. Okay, they don't care about anybody else, just what's happening for them. Okay, Stalin was getting his rear end kicked by Hitler. Okay, and he kept bugging through channels at their meetings Roosevelt and Churchill to start a Western front from France and England. And he was annoyed. He didn't like them because they couldn't do it. And he used to say, "Why aren't you doing it? Why aren't you doing it?" And they kept saying, "We're not ready to do it. We can't." And that is true. We were so far down in weapons manufacture or having a large enough army that starting with 41 and into 42, we had a lot of catch up to do before you could invade Europe. Okay? We weren't in a position to invade Europe. First, you have to have a staging area. And England became the staging area. And you get to get the army, the equipment, and everything into England. And you had to get army and equipment into England for the English army, which barely survived at Dunkirk. And getting along when all these troops were moved into England was paramount. You put people together in England, if they don't have anything to do, they start fighting, and it's if you've ever been in the military, you know what you mean. You know what I mean. So the fact that the England were really good about it, and they were scared. They came this close to losing to Germany, and so both our sides busted their butts as partners to do this. And they were equal partners. And that's what won the war, essentially, in Europe. And, but meanwhile, Stalin's sitting there. He's got all these plans floating around his head for what he wants to do to conquer the world as a dictator, but he can't do anything. His hands are tied. Now, the way he thought, and this is important, if he could get the Allies to invade from the West, then he could then start preparing for what he viewed as his world takeover after the war. In other words, he was going to let us do the hard work and then after the war use his own tools to take over the world, so to speak. His ego was out of control, and he lived in a grandiose world where he thought he was God, just like Hitler, and that it would be easy. He'd do it all from the inside. Okay? Well, they had a rough time because the Germans pounded them a lot, and a lot of people died just waiting for that. The Russians couldn't do much until the Allies invaded Normandy. And Stalin understood the military situation, as did we. Invading from the West took the pressure off of the Russians. That allowed them to start mounting attacks, which began to work. Okay? Until we invaded at Normandy, they couldn't do that. But once we invaded at Normandy and started to move eastward, Hitler had to concentrate almost all of his energy and troops against the Allies coming in from Normandy. As a result, that softened the Eastern Front against Russia, and Russia was able to then force the Germans to slowly move backwards. And that worked. Eventually, the war ended on May 7th, 1945. The problem was, in that time, but you don't know that, they even had Stalin, they even had good relations in the U.S. Some people were referring to him as Uncle Joe, which is ridiculous. We didn't know till years later that he was nobody's Uncle Joe. Anyway, what he did, and this is important because it's done today, okay, is he developed a system for taking over governments from the inside. Got that? So that he didn't have to use his army. He couldn't use his army because, like us, they were tired out. Okay, there was no way anybody was going to fight in 1946. They couldn't. They were physically important. They were physically wiped out, exhausted, and battle fatigue, whatever you want to call it. The civilians couldn't take it anymore. Basically, the only thing you could do after 45 was work from the inside. And Russia used the fact that they had a big army sitting in Russia and south towards the small countries that made up the Soviet Union. So what he started doing after Normandy, and he could see that Normandy was secure, so that he could then start working on this and not worrying as much as he did. He developed the plan, and this is a plan that's important for us to know because his successors happens to be Vladimir Putin. Now, what Vladimir Putin came up through the KGB at the end of the Cold War. Okay, that you have to keep in mind. Why? Because what Stalin put together, were people he later called the KGB. Guess what? Same KGB. Initially, they would go into these countries and they would find people who would do whatever Stalin said under the table. And they would hold elections on as ostensibly free elections. Once they got in power, they would then say, all right, I think the best way for us to go is towards communism. And to do that, we have to work with and become part of the Soviet Union. Okay. Now, if the people didn't like it, Russia had this big army sitting north of them and would move right into the country, and no one had a stomach for fighting anymore. So for them, they just accepted this. And Stalin was very successful. He ended up co-opting 21 of the smaller countries, including Poland. And we couldn't do anything about it. And they basically couldn't. If we had the strength to do it, we might have, but we didn't. And that's a fact of life. When you get into big wars like World War II was, nobody could have fought in a war. And that's what we have to live with. But that's how he did it. And let me tell you, they did a playbook. And he tried then to extend it outside of his country to the West. He had made a deal with Roosevelt and Churchill in England in early 45, drawing a line and got them to accept it, that his territory, the western edge, was Poland, and East Germany, okay? And that they shouldn't touch it. And in agreement, he wouldn't touch Western Europe as a territory. As you know, dictators lie all the time. They sign agreements that they don't intend to keep all the time. Got that? That's part of their thinking. And they justify it because they're God. And in their minds, they're God, and they don't like anybody to question them. And in their mind, because they're God, they just eliminate anybody who questions them. Just the way Robespierre did in France, just the way Hitler did in Germany, and that's the way the Russians were too. Now, so as these countries fell because of the way Stalin and the people with him, he couldn't do everything, put it together, and the process, making up their playbook for communism and takeovers, they worked so well that starting around 1947, he started to, it's like a cancer that grows. Got that? His tumor tendrils started out, and he started to move people into Iran and Greece. And they started to have free elections. But by then there was enough, our OSS was becoming the CIA. And thank God for Britain. Britain had the most sophisticated and I think best intelligence agency in the world at that time. And Stalin couldn't make a move without everybody knowing about it, even though he thought it was all secret and he was going to get away with it. So what happened is, in order to make it stick that he couldn't do it, Harry Truman, who was then president, came out with a policy, and it was called the Truman Doctrine. And I believe that was in end of 47 or middle of 47. I'm afraid I don't have all my dates straight. And it worked. He basically told Stalin, you go back behind the line you agreed to. If not, and I don't know if they got the if not or not. But basically, Stalin understood it and dropped his plans to take over Greece and Iran and move back to Russia. Well, he lost a lot of face. Those dictators, when they lose face, they can't stand it. And he couldn't go to war. We still were far better at making weapons and having the nuclear weapons. So he couldn't think of fighting against the U.S. at all. He wouldn't stand a chance. So what he did later on, instead of it, he started by closing the highways into Berlin from the Western sector and refused to allow any Western trucks, vehicles into Berlin, which violated the agreement that was made at the end of the war. So Harry Truman was presented with the possibility that a war would start with Russia if he tried to block it in any way. But Stalin was smart enough, at least, cover his own rear end, in that he allowed planes from the West to just fly in any time of the day or night into Berlin's airport. So Truman and his advisors, mind you, none of these people can work without their advisors, including ours. And they decided to initiate an airlift to supply Berlin with all of its needs indefinitely till Russians gave up, because this was costing them money too, and tension. So what he did, we had a lot of, they're civilian-wise, they're called the DC-3s, the famous plane. And in the Army, Air Corps, and Air Force, they were called C-47s, okay? There was thousands of them left over after the war. So what they did, they spiffed them up, and they had come out with newer planes, and they started flying planes into Berlin, so one would land every 15 minutes around the clock. And then they would fly out, and they continued to bring in the food for 18 months. This was a major, major operation. It's incredible. And sometimes you got to think about what you're doing, because if Truman had moved his army our army into position and just went after Berlin in a military manner where we started a war, it would have been a whole lot of people would have ended up dead. I have no doubt in my own mind that if they did that, Hitler would have, Stalin would have lost, but we'd have a lot of dead Americans and they'd have a lot of dead Russians before the whole thing was over with. So it cost a lot of money for the Berlin airlift, but it worked. After 18 months, Stalin threw in the towel and opened up the highway to all traffic and never attempted, he died before he could ever attempt that again. And everything calmed down for a while because then Stalin started helping with China supply North Korea what was to become the Korean War. Now, nobody knew that. We didn't have satellites. We didn't have enough of a worldwide intelligence network to understand what they were doing, okay? And I will talk more about this when we get to the history. So what they did, they were able to, and this is a major feat, and I'll go into it more, tunneled under the DMZ between North Korea and South Korea to the point where they can come up behind the U.S. troops, the British troops, and the other United Nations troops. And as a result, it became a disaster. And the only thing the troops could do was retreat. And they retreated south. And we're getting close to the ocean. And that's when, of course, the famous Incheon invasion took place. They started moving the Allies north of the North Korean army. And they realized, in this case, it was Mao Zedong and Stalin. And they realized they were out of luck. If they didn't move quickly, their armies were all going to be encircled in South Korea, and the war would essentially be over, and they would have to surrender. There was nothing else they could do. So the North Korean army was ordered to withdraw, which they did. Fact is, they had no choice. They were pushed almost to the Chinese border in North Korea. And that's where, now the next guy in line is Mao Zedong. He's the next dictator. That's where Mao got stuck, okay? He realized that he had to do something. And so he started moving men and supplies necessary for an invasion of North Korea up to the river that was the border between the two countries, known as the Yalu River, Yaloo. And they all had a feeling for what was coming. And this is where Douglas MacArthur got himself in trouble. He was threatening, he was using intelligence to pass on threats to China that if they crossed the Yalu River, he was going to use nuclear bombs on their major cities. That was a no-no. It still is a no-no. Nuclear bombs are not used for warfare because there's no stopping them. And when they blow up, they're going to take a couple 100,000 people with them. Nobody can last through that. It's what they call mutually assured destruction that stabilized the Cold War. So at this point, MacArthur was fired. Truman went to Guam and ordered MacArthur to come to Guam, which he did. And he ordered him to never, ever mention nuclear weapons again. Okay. Now, I agree with this. You don't joke or mess around and threaten people with nuclear weapons. It just shouldn't be done because nuclear weapons should not be used in normal warfare, period. You can't control them and what they do. So MacArthur agreed, flew back to North Korea or Korea. Truman flew back to Washington, and MacArthur continued to send out the threats they were going to use nuclear weapons. At that point, Truman was angry and fired MacArthur. That was probably the best thing he could do by far. And I'm sure Truman wasn't stupid enough to he didn't have ego like that to just go fire him. He was working with George Marshall, who was head of the army then. And George Marshall was probably, next to Eisenhower, the best general we ever had. And Marshall gave him the permission to fire MacArthur, okay? Without the Army's assent to that, there could have been all kinds of trouble. But MacArthur basically was not a well-liked human being, even in the Army. He was a basic narcissistic sociopathic personality disorder, and acted like it. So they realized that he was no longer of use and had become a loose cannon and a danger, and they had to get rid of him. And they did. And it was the right thing to do because he was not mentally stable at that point. So, and I'll talk about more about that when we get to the Korean War later on. So that sums up Joseph Stalin, and it sums up Mao Zedong. Unfortunately, Mao got himself in a lot of trouble. Why? Because once the Allies had destroyed much of the North Koreans' armory in terms of tanks and other things, China was broke. That's the reality of it. China had to go home. But they wouldn't. They wouldn't quit, and they'd sit there. And by beginning of 52, they started talking about withdrawal and what it would take to get a withdrawal. And like any true narcissistic, sociopathic personality disorder, they refused to negotiate. We'll talk about it, but they rejected everything. They figured if they could wait out the UN, that we'd go home first. It's like playing chicken, two cars coming at each other. You want to see who turns aside first. And it's a dangerous game to play, certainly in warfare. So the negotiations stalled because you basically told them the best you're going to get is to move back to the dividing line between North and South Korea, which happened to be the 38th parallel of latitude going east-west around the world. And they said, no, we're not. We've got people south of that. We're not going to withdraw. Screw you. And they sat. Finally, around the fall of 1952, they finally agreed to accept the 38th parallel as the ending of the war. And then the war looked like it was going to be over. Now, people understood now that the Chinese economy was so shaky that they really couldn't continue a warfare. And Russia stepped out of it a long time ago. They never sent troops. They sent planes and pilots, but they didn't send troops. So by the time they had reached this agreement, though, the election was over. Eisenhower was going to be president in January, and that was that. So we backed off, and Eisenhower came along. He and the people he relied on, and George Marshall was still there, thank God, they went and they reviewed the situation. And what they discovered was that the 38th parallel was drawn too far south originally in 1945. Got that? And so they redrew it, I don't know how many miles north, and the Chinese went berserk and withdrew from the negotiations. But Eisenhower was smart enough at this point to know all the aspects of this military situation, and he knew China couldn't hold out, that if they refused to come back to the table, their whole government was going to collapse. Okay? So he just waited. Okay, if you don't want it, don't take it, but we're not going to change. And he didn't. It took 6 months into August before they came around in 1953 and accepted the agreement. They never signed a treaty, but they accepted the agreement. Now, why was it worth going through all that? Well, it's very simple. The tunnels weren't just dirt tunnels that soldiers crawled through. Of course not. They were big tunnels of this type that you put under rivers for highways, okay? They were like the Holland Tunnel under the rivers in New York, the 2 tunnels. And they were big, they had ventilation, but you have to after about 300 feet, all tunnels have to have ventilation because the oxygen level drops, and it won't sustain life. So, they had fans, they had ventilation, uh, the walls were supported with mortar, bricks, and proper support so they wouldn't fall down after 5 years, and what it meant was, if we had accepted the old 38th parallel, the North Koreans and the Chinese would have had access to them again to make them important militarily, and that's dangerous, very dangerous, okay, because they probably would have done it. And we didn't have satellites and all the other stuff. Our jet planes weren't up to what they became and all those other things. So what happened next was, as I said, Eisenhower folded his hands and say, "Okay, we're going on with life. You decide when you want to come back." And they sat it out for 6 months, and finally they couldn't do it anymore. Uh, Mao had to come back to the table. And knowing that Mao was very egotistical, and he made one concession, okay? He told Mao that they would not publicize redrawing the 38th parallel so that his people in his country would think they're at the same 38th parallel. Okay, got that? And Mao took it. He didn't have much choice. And if he would have refused, I think he could have been pressured into taking it and being public about it. It would have publicly humiliated him, and he could have lost control of China and been overthrown. Uh, but nobody wanted to continue the fight. China had to go do their own thing. We had to get over the wars business because there'd been too much war in the past 15, 20 years for anybody to live with. And that ended that. And Mao went back and became the dictator again, which case he also took the first class and put them in internment camps and brainwashed them. And it became known as the Red Guard movement. And it lasted, well into the end of the 60s. Then Mao began slipping. And his wife, he had Alzheimer's disease or one of those sorts. And his wife and 3 of his associates took over running the country. And the people got fed up with it. And Mao finally just died in 1972. And the Chinese then went ahead and threw out Mrs. Mao and what they called the Gang of Four. Okay. And the guys that came along were much more practical and Henry Kissinger started, they made agreements and we got along, you know, until the last maybe 10, 15 years, but they got more aggressive again. But so is everybody, Russia, even us. And as you know, with uh, DJ Trees, DJT sitting in the presidency. So that's Mao. Okay. And he really was the last major dictator going back to the pre-World War II days. Now we move forward. Here's the next dictator, Iran. Okay. We got okay with the Iran. The Shah worked with us. We did prevent his country from being taken over by Russia in 1948. These are the things. And what you ended up with is a new dictator. 2 of them. And I can't remember Khomeini's first name, but he was the first. He organized the so-called revolution in 1979, overthrew the Shah. The Shah had cancer, and he wasn't capable of fighting. So he had to give up, came to the West to get cancer treatment. He went to New York, and he got by for a couple of years. Now, unfortunately, the new government, led by Khomeini, took over, And just like Stalin did with the Russians back in 1946, he did the same in Iran. And he got people, "Oh, we're gonna have a democracy. We're tired the Shah was a terrible dictator," which he wasn't. Compared to what came later, he was not a dictator at all. And what happened was, as soon as the Shah was done and gone, and Khomeini took over as the supreme leader, they used the army to attack our embassy. Okay, something that had never been done by anybody before. And I never understood it at the time. It took me about 25 years to begin to understand it. But embassies are useful for many things, to help travelers from their countries in trouble in that when they get to the foreign country, and they're also espionage centers. Okay? That's a given. That's accepted in the world. Okay? Why? It keeps a lid on trouble. If we know what the enemy is doing, and the enemy knows what we're doing, and we keep strength up, well, that's fine, because no one's going to want to start a war in the modern era. God, no. Okay? And so it helps keep the peace to accept the embassies as espionage centers. And it's real. Okay? And it does work. So nobody wants to damage the system. Okay? There's no reason for it. But instead, Khomeini decided he already had a plan. And he knew within his own people, that if the embassy were still there, his government could never take hold. And it wasn't just that. He was planning to take over the entire Arab world and maybe more later on. And I'll talk more about that in the next section, which will be history. And Khomeini knew that with American espionage people, as well as the ambassador, as well as the troops that were there, and they were armed to the teeth, that he had to take over the embassy. So he started university students protesting the Americans, and it made it nastier and nasty, and they started protesting outside the embassy, except they weren't all students. Okay, this type of stuff doesn't go down the way it did unless you got regular troops. I would estimate that the minimum amount of regular troops they had in those so-called students was at least 50%. Okay, maybe even more. That's why we basically surrendered the embassy when we did, because there were nothing but students, and you had, well-trained, well-organized unit of Marines. There were 25 Marines there with plenty of weapons, plenty of ammunition, who were able to cover the gates. And when the gates fell down, and if we're just students, and you fired some shots, mostly students would turn around and walk away. Okay? The only ones that would charge through the gates and be ready to fight were the regular troops. Okay? They're trained for that. Just like our Marines are trained for that. And our Army. So it's like you had no choice. Okay? You either started fighting and using your machine guns, or you had to surrender it. Okay? I've never been a fan of Jimmy Carter, even though I'm a Democrat. But I don't know that he had any other choice. And so he did surrender it. And that was that. Now, Khomeini, in the meantime, started organizing units of terrorists. Okay? And soon, however, that his plan to export terrorism ran into a roadblock when he had a war with Iran. Okay? Or Iraq. I am sorry. Iraq apparently invaded some territory they had for oil purposes. And they fought for 8 years. Didn't accomplish anything, and they finally quit. At that point, Khomeini died. And his successor, Syed Khamenei took over, and he was worse than Khomeini, far worse. And he established a rigid dictatorship, and he established support for the terrorism groups that came to dominate us since that time, with suicide bombers, with attacks, terrorist attacks. And Kamenev was quite good about it. It was like Stalin, I suppose, that he learned from Stalin and Hitler, because he would sit there and say, it's all these terrorists that are doing this. We're not doing anything. We're fine. Well, you're wrong. Okay. Because slowly, Lebanon fell to them, Syria, and they started spreading these terrorism attacks across the world. And I was surprised. I couldn't understand what they were trying to do and how they were doing it. And then I learned the first step when I started looking and researching it and watching the history intently as this was happening. Then I learned first, when I was doing the research for my book, that the term Ayatollah doesn't exist in the Muslim religion. No other Muslim country outside of Iran accepts the term Ayatollah. And when you look at what you get with the Ayatollahs, it's like basically a group of fanatics who took over the country like they did. And their ultimate goal in life is to export Islam to the point where it controls the whole world. And in this case, Islam equates with them. Okay. Islam is not that type of religion. It's a peaceful religion. But to people with that personality disorder, the narcissistic, sociopathic personality disorders, they don't give a damn. They don't really give a damn about the religion either. Okay? They're just using it to manipulate their people to the point where their people can't rebel without a war. And what you do is, what they've done, and they've taken that over. Now, by supporting the terrorists, what did they do for the terrorists? They provided space for them to train. They provided ammunition, guns, big guns, and a lot of supplies, food, everything like that, so they could ply their trade. And the bigger territorial terrorist organizations developed. And of course, the most well-known one of that was bin Laden. And his group became the more public group. And they had gotten suicide bombers all the way from Australia into Indonesia, into Japan, into India, even into Russia, in Moscow, and in southern Russia, as well as France, Spain, and England. And they couldn't really get across the Atlantic Ocean and get in and do anything. But we weren't tight enough. We didn't think anybody could come across the Atlantic Ocean, but we were wrong. Okay? Same way we were in 1941 about thinking about the Japanese, is they wouldn't dare attack us. We were wrong then, too. So what happened was they sent a number of trained suicide terrorists, about 25 of them. Their goal, at the right time and the right command, they were to first learn how to fly Boeing 737s or whichever planes were flying. And as a result, at the same time and the same day, on September 11th, 2001, they were to get on the planes, commandeer the planes, which they did, and then dive the airliners into pre-selected targets. And it worked, sadly. Two planes hit the World Trade Centers. One plane hit the Pentagon. And the fourth plane, they're going to use 4 planes. The 4th plane, uh, the passengers revolted, and the pilot in the cabin, at this outbreak of their revolt, put the plane into a straight dive, which makes it impossible for anybody to gain control, and flew it right into the ground. And that was near Philadelphia, okay? So, 4 planes loaded with terrorists, uh, created an enormous amount of danger and destruction, and that's when we realized, hey, at this point, Common Eye is aggressive and he's for real, and we gotta do what we can to stop him. Now, I didn't appreciate this 25 years ago, 'cause I was still trying to figure out what's going on, but as over the next 3 years and listening to various people who had access to intelligence, I realized these people believed that if they, and this is true, is what they believe, if you had the governments destabilized in Russia, Japan, China, United States, Canada, wherever else, that they, the little tiny Iran, could then easily walk in and take them all over because people were too tired to fight. And then they would run the world. And if the people involved in the countries didn't accept it, well, then they would all be second-class citizens, and only Muslims would run the countries, the economy, the bureaucracy, you name it. That, folks, is by definition a delusion, a bad delusion. And their problem, their delusion thought that by doing this, if it took 10 generations and they kept doing it for 10 generations, they'd win. Okay? Well, the problem is, thank God, and I do thank God for this, by the way, is that generations change. Children, as they hit the teen years, they have to develop their own personal identities for their life, okay? And in most cases, they're gonna clash with their parents in the previous generation. Just look at the '60s, okay? And it's harder to do that in totalitarian governments, but they will. They'll clash at home, all right? They, with the internet, they can read and see, and they know what's going on is not right and is wrong. And antipathy to this will start to build up. Anger against this will start to build up. And yes, if while the old generation still got controls, they're not going to be able to do much. But the old generation is going to die. Okay, the new ones are going to start to take over. They may use the same BS to get in control, but you'll find suddenly that they don't. China's an excellent example of this. Once Mao was gone and his wife. Okay, the next group that came along were pragmatic people who wanted to be part of the world. And they did. Slowly, they were hoping to wean their people out of the attitude they had during the '60s. And to some extent, they did. So, but that's what happens. There's a natural order of things that, by the way we're built biologically, that works against people establishing a, like Hitler called it, a 1,000-year Reich, or like what Khamenei called it, probably Persian term for the same thing. It's always the same thing, guys. There's nothing new about this. So it is important. And any dictatorships, any people coming up decided the dictatorship's the answer, they have a school to go to. They have a game plan that started with Adolf Hitler and laid out very well by Joseph Stalin. And they claim to be successful. And they're very often people who want to live like that. It's inconsistent with normal human behavior. And they don't see it that way. They see normal human behavior as being wrong, okay? And they're going to change it to the right way, which, of course, is the wrong way. Got that? Okay. And if they're lucky and get there, sooner or later, it ends up in major warfares, rebellions, and a lot of people dead. World War II is probably the worst example of anything like that in history. So, Khamenei doesn't understand that, or his people. Now, before he was killed, after the missiles went in to destroy their underground nuclear facilities, uh, and people at home in Iran started demonstrating in large numbers. His response and his answers to that problem was to kill 6,000 people, innocent people, just gun them down on the streets, the people who were demonstrating. Okay, that was his answer, and he figured that would terrify them into stopping. They did. They had no choice. Okay, but what they didn't understand is that the anger that these actions cause doesn't go away. It goes down into the people, into their souls, and it spreads because there's no way they can express themselves or their anger politically, and it'll just spread. And eventually it's going to explode, but it might be 100 years if it weren't for the rest of the world. Okay, one of the things we have done, yes, using intelligence agents and sending people in to help understand materials, weapons, and then when they get enough courage to start an organized warfare, uh, we start supplying them with weaponry. Okay, Ukraine is a perfectly good example of a combination of intelligence, rebellion, and force from us. We don't have to send men, we only have to send the equipment, the ammunition, even maybe some food, and it's expensive, but I guarantee you, the way it was going, it will be a lot cheaper to do that than to not do that, and farther down the line and end up having to invade the country and throw the dictator out or find a way to do that, okay? One thing you have to know when you wanna get rid of dictators, okay, the people that are in there are ready to organize themselves and fight for their freedom and to be free. If they aren't, and they're only gonna give in to the person with the biggest and largest number of weapons, then you don't wanna send your own people in to fight them, okay? You wanna make sure they're like Ukraine, all right? That's important. The weapons we put into Ukraine, all the advanced weaponry, and the people who would teach them how to use it was working, okay? If the Middle Eastern war, the Iranians hadn't started that, Putin was gonna have to back off and lose what he gained, and possibly even have Ukrainians move into Russia themselves. It was working. The Russians were backing up, okay? But once and there's collusion for this, and we'll talk about that again in the history. The invasion from Hamas into Israel, the way it went down, uh, stopped the Ukrainians from getting all of our attention and help. And Russia tried to take advantage of that, but it seems to have gotten to the point where it's a stalemate now, as was what happened in Gaza. Now, one thing about Gaza, okay, and I'm gonna not mention this now. I'm gonna wait until we get to the history part. And, that was a combination of Putin getting Khamenei to start his own war, which they wanted to do anyway, uh, to take the pressure off himself. Remember, the dictators, they're very insecure, and the worst thing that can happen is they lose face in their country, okay? If the Ukrainians continue to push the Russians out, then Putin would have lost a lot of faith with not just the population, but with some of the power brokers behind the scenes that keep him in power, and he might have gotten retired. So he had to do something, and there was nothing that Iran could give him that would help. He tried for drones, he tried for other things, and somehow they came up with the idea. I don't know if it was Putin, but it might have been Iran. That Khamenei said, "We'll have Hamas invade from Gaza into Israel in an in a terrorist attack, killing a lot of people and taking people hostages to prevent them from going back into Gaza to take them back, because Westerners don't like to do that." Okay. However, that's the way the Easterners think. In all of the Arab lands, including Iran, including Pakistan is like that. Uh, and about the only Muslim country that I know that isn't like that is Indonesia. They're good people, and their view of Islam is a good view. And but what Iran had done. There's what's going on in North Africa. There's the revolution going on in Yemen. And in those cases, yes, Iran is supporting with weapons, machinery, maybe even food with the people in Yemen. And the outgrowth of Hamas in those groups was ISIS. Okay. Everybody talked about ISIS was out of control. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. It could be that Khamenei was seeing how far he could get using ISIS. And that was that. So these guys are bad news dictators. Okay. They don't want to stop, and they won't, any more than Hitler would have stopped. Okay. Any more than Stalin would have stopped. Got that? Or Mao Zedong. So now we've got modern days. And what have we got today? Aside from Khamenei, who's now dead, we've got Putin. Putin's the most aggressive and the worst one now. Okay. And whoever's in charge in Iran might be just as bad. That's confusion now. But Putin's the worst. And if you're wondering, in the past, when that Mideast war between Gaza, supposedly, and Hamas and Israel began, with 1,300 Israelis being murdered and another 50 or 100 hostages later on being murdered, you'll start to understand how these people think, okay? And they don't care. They don't care that first attack murdered babies, children, men, women, everybody, okay? And they didn't ask for your nationality or religion or anything, okay? That's the way these people think, that terrorism will frighten them into doing anything. Well, in the past, Israel has been under the gun for the last 25 years because the Persians, the Iranians, have been using Hamas and Hezbollah to cause trouble as much as possible they can get away with. They figure they'll pressure Israel to the point where they'd rather go elsewhere and abandon it. They won't. No, not after the way they came to Israel in the first place and what happened when they took over from the Philippines with David in the lead, and then later Solomon. No. And then only being kicked out of the country because of the Romans. They were a positive part of the Mideastern culture. And as a result, the Israelis, especially what happened to them in Nazi Germany, they're going to dig in, and come hell or high water, they're not leaving. And if you go to the country and look at the smallness of it and the danger they live with on a day-to-day basis, and all the hate that has been directed against them, it's like all the hate that the Nazis directed against them, somehow ended up in the Middle East and has been directed against Israel. And it's God knows why, all right? And one of the problems, if you send an army into a country by surprise to start bombarding it and murdering people and end up murdering 1,400 people and then leave with 200 hostages, you cannot expect anything else from the Israelis than what they've done. All right? That's the way people think. They turn it around on them. Okay, you're gonna do it, you're gonna get it back. Okay? You're gonna murder our babies and our children, we'll do the same with you if that's what it takes. It's rough and it's brutal. And when you go through history, that type of brutality has existed, especially in wars, on an ongoing basis till about, I would guess, it began to clean up around 1400, 1500, but still wasn't that good. It wasn't until the development of repeating rifles and all that that everything became it was obvious to everybody that they can't fight anymore because it's too deadly. And that's just an opinion on my part, okay? But, we'll go through that more when I go through the history of Western Europe, Mideast prior to we starting up in 1600. There's a lot that ties us both together. But the most important thing is our history, the real and unvarnished history of the US of A. So I am going to close with that now. And our next podcast, my next podcast, and I will get to it soon, Monday or Tuesday, is going to be the real Russian affair against us during Trump's first administration. And it's real, folks. There's nothing fake about it. They were planned to propagandize us, to float confusion, and keep us off balance to get Trump to remain as president for life, okay? And by so doing, they co-opted Trump, and they couldn't tell him what to do all the time. But on big things important to them, yeah, they could tell him, and they did. And the proof of that lies in the Helsinki conference in July of 2018. And we'll talk about that. We'll go through that so you can see it. And I will use examples from history to show how that has worked as far back as 2,000 years ago. Okay, we've got enough history and understanding back that far in many instances that I can help show it how it works and prove it to you. And the only thing I will tell you, yeah, it's we don't have physical proof, but you don't need physical proofs when you understand human nature based on psychology and genetics. All right, because things repeat over and over. Anyway, thank you. I'm going to sign out now. Bye.